Cannonball pyramids at Chickamauga National Battlefield commemorate places where 8 commanding officers were killed or mortally wounded. 7 honor colonels or generals from Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, Wisconsin, Indiana, and 2 from Ohio. The 8th marks the ground where Colonel Peyton Colquitt fell while steadying his men on September 20th, 1863. Over the years, I have given particular attention to his monument, partly because Colquitt was one of our own, a Georgian, and partly because I was aware of a poignant matter connected with his death. The matter caught my attention 30 years ago when I was working on a story about a Confederate court-martial. Peyton's older brother, General Alfred H. Colquitt, had approved charges against one of his subordinate officers for misconduct under fire, and then word came that Peyton had been mortally wounded at Chickamauga. General Colquitt abruptly left Charleston to take a train to northwest Georgia to escort his brother's body home, which delayed the court-martial proceedings. General Colquitt's trip wasn't significant to the court-martial story, but it brought to life what had happened. Until that moment, Peyton Colquitt had been only a name on a battlefield monument, but by virtue of the newfound awareness of Alfred Colquitt's painful pilgrimage to recover his brother's remains, Peyton became flesh and blood. Ever since, that awareness has imparted a solemn intimacy to each visit to his monument. 19th century Georgia poet Jane Thigpen wrote the death of Peyton Colquitt in tribute to the slain officer, and I'll post that at the end of this video. Poets might best describe how lovers of history feel when a name comes alive or a place becomes hallowed. In 2012, I had the good fortune to tour Chickamauga with Emma Cottrell, a gifted Atlanta poet. Emma wrote a note putting it this way: "Someday I will get back to Chickamauga and view the Cannonball Monument with you. I wonder if he, Peyton, would not become very real to me then, something of him still remaining. Perhaps it is the strange atmosphere around Chickamauga, as if, even though the bodies are not there, something of the soul remains, or perhaps the last of the personal energy they expended on earth." Emma's words captured the haunting, melancholy feeling of my visits to Peyton Colquitt's monument. That wasn't unprecedented at Chickamauga, for I had previously experienced 3 other transitions from just a name to he was flesh and blood. For General William Lytle, when I learned that a lock of his hair was sent home to his family. For General Benjamin Helm, when I read Abraham Lincoln's telegram to Mrs. Lincoln informing her of the death of her brother-in-law. And for Colonel Hans Hegg, when I read the lovely letter he wrote to his wife on the eve of his death. Turning to the September 1863 court-martial in Charleston, General Colquitt's absence worked a hardship on the accused, Colonel Emory F. Best. Charged with shameful conduct under fire, Best was removed from command of the 23rd Georgia Regiment. For 3 long months the allegations stained his honor, so he urged General Colquitt to convene the court-martial. Best wrote, "There is certainly some great injustice done either to myself or the service in retaining me so long under arrest without a trial, and I now respectfully request that a court be convened for my trial." But the general's trip to Georgia delayed proceedings for 2 more months. I first came across Emory Best's name in the 1990s, and it seemed a delightful coincidence that we shared some things in common. We both came to Rome, Georgia as young lawyers, Best in 1860, me in 1986, and we both ended up in Floyd Springs, Best to enlist in the Floyd Springs Guards at the beginning of the Civil War, and me more than a century later to take up residence. These commonalities intensified my interest in Colonel Best and his story. At the time of his court-martial in November 1863, Best had been living in an uncomfortable state of twilight, removed from command and tainted by allegations of dishonor for more than 5 months. Some of the most serious charges were levied by Major Marcus R. Ballinger, whom Best had leapfrogged in rank. Best felt that this led to bad blood between them. The court-martial commenced on November 23, 1863, and lasted 7 days. 14 witnesses testified for the prosecution and 13 for the defense. Most testimony focused on Best's conduct at the Battle of Chancellorsville, when an enemy brigade overwhelmed the 23rd Georgia Regiment. Best and 20 of his men escaped, but 200 others surrendered. At the trial, a captain testified that he had received no notice from the accused of his intention to leave the command there, nor did I receive any order from the accused for the retreat from there. Several others said that Best failed to order the regiment to retreat before making his own escape. A lieutenant claimed that Best walked away, quote, pretty fast, close quote, and then when the enemy fired a volley, quote, moved faster than a double quick. I would call it a run, close quote. Others disagreed. One officer, quote, saw nothing unusual in the conduct of the accused, close quote. A witness for the prosecution conceded that Best, quote, did about as well as could be done as far as I noticed him, close quote, and several officers testified that Best had, in fact, given an order for the retreat. The prosecutor countered that even if Best gave the order, he abandoned his men by failing to see that it was carried out. Quote, an officer's responsibility does not cease with the issuing of an order, close quote. The prosecutor argued, quote, he is bound to superintend its execution, close quote. Had Best not run away in a, quote, disgraceful flight, he would have discovered before he had run a half mile that but 2 or 3 of his officers and some 20 men were following him, close quote. The prosecutor concluded by noting that, quote, an officer who quits his post or command in danger without justification or excuse quits it shamefully, close quote. The court reached its verdict on December 7, 1863. Best was acquitted on 4 of 5 specifications of wrongdoing, but on the 5th, addressing his conduct at Chancellorsville, the court found that he did, quote, shamefully run away and shamefully abandon and leave his regiment upon the approach of the enemy, close quote. Best was dismissed from the Army and spent the rest of the war trying to clear his name. The final entry in his service record indicates that he was training young soldiers in Richmond in a civilian capacity as the war drew to an end. After the war, Best enjoyed a measure of success as a lawyer. He served as a city court judge in Macon, receiving the appointment from his former commanding officer, Alfred Colquitt, who was by then governor of Georgia. In 1887, Best took a position with the Interior Department in Washington, D.C., where he worked for the rest of his life. Emory Best didn't have children, but in 1996 I spoke with his namesake, Emory Fred Best. Fred, the grandson of Colonel Best's brother, was a 76-year-old California businessman. He said that the family had never mentioned Emory's court-martial and that the stain of dishonor on his record was appalling. It is a testimony to the Civil War's lasting impact that even 130 years later, some still had a personal interest in the affairs of that great war. When I asked Fred Best whether he believed that the charges against his great-uncle were true, he replied softly, "Oh, that can't be. I would like to think not." Then he interjected something surprising into our conversation. "Are you," he asked, "any relation to Daniel C. Roper?" Intrigued, I replied, "Yes, why?" "He gave me my first job." I was astonished. Daniel C. Roper, a relative on my father's side of the family, was Secretary of Commerce in the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s. He gave young Fred Best an entry-level job in the federal government in Washington, thus establishing an unexpected bond between me and Emory Best, the Confederate officer I was writing about. I concede that that bond, that willowy filament in the web of history, is a slender one, but it's a remarkable example of the interconnectivity of Georgia history. This interconnectivity established a link between an officer killed at Chickamauga in 1863, a bereaved brother traveling to Chickamauga, an officer disgraced in Charleston, a helpful Secretary of Commerce in the 1930s, an elderly businessman dismayed in California in 1996, and a magazine editor in Rome, Georgia in 2024. Spanning 160 years on a continent, Georgia history worked its magic by establishing these connections. To read Jesse Thigpen's poem, The Death of Colonel Peyton Colquitt, pause the video here, and thank you for watching this Georgia Backroads program.